All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Andrew Freedman, Communications and Software Sector Head here at Hedgeye. I am pleased to be joined with the one and only Sam Rahman from Hedgeye Asset Management, who is a portfolio manager. And we're starting things off strong here, guys, this morning because I got an echo on my computer. All right. Just fixed it. Sorry about that. It's all right. It's can only get better from.
Yeah, I can only deal with one Andrew Freedman, but if there's two, I'm really in trouble.
Yeah, no, my wife would say the same thing. So, anyway, really excited to be doing this. Sam and I, we kind of go back about 6 years. We've been going back and forth talking about secular trends in technology and media. More recently, he's come and joined as portfolio manager at Hedgeye Asset Management. And so I get an opportunity to continue to work with him and, definitely some of the more thoughtful, bigger picture conversations that I really enjoyed. Not that I don't have, not that all my conversations with, with buy-siders are wonderful, but I've always really enjoyed speaking with you. And so we decided to, do this today and just make it open. And the purpose of this is to probably be the first of many, hopefully, and to be kind of casual and just basically allow you to be a fly on the wall, you as anyone who's listening to a conversation that a portfolio manager would have with an analyst, and just talking about relevant topics, news items, and things that are impacting the technology space and media space. And so we have a lot of topics to go through. Hopefully we'll get through all of them. Sam and I have already kind of talked these out previously, so it's going to be a little bit of a rehash, but I think the second time will only be better. And, with that, Sam, I don't know if you have anything you want to say off the bat. Otherwise, I have a couple of questions and things to throw at you and we can get into it.
Yeah, I just want to say just thank you for having me on. Likewise, I think we go back a little bit further than that, Andrew. I remember talking to you about Netflix. I think it was maybe 2016 or so. And our conversations have been sort of ongoing, continuous ever since then. And yeah, I agree too. Like it's really nice to talk to somebody who obviously you're in the weeds with the P&L, but just nice to talk about these companies kind of strategically from a
Big picture
top-down level to really understand these models. Because I think, if you're able to go back in time 10, 12 years and really understand what these businesses were going to become of the coming 10 years, I think you would have been long most of these names, and that would have made most of your performance, if not, a significant amount of it. And the folks that missed that run, which I think was like probably one of the few great sort of trending performance runs from a small group of companies, I think, in the history of markets, not
such
just
a
in terms of
it's
price
such a
performance, but also returns.
Yeah, I mean, the
Uh,
growth, it was the best bull market for growth investors ever,
right, right,
right? Like, and I can only hope that maybe we get one of those again, because it was a period of 0% interest rates, disruption, new technology, and it was just very steady state, right? It
right,
wasn't like the volatility that we're necessarily seeing now.
right.
Yeah, no, it was a it was a great time. And but from a process standpoint too, it's always helpful, and something that I try to do a lot is not to miss the forest for the trees too much, and
Right.
really understanding these bigger picture trends, because I think while you have to navigate the shorter term volatility, right, and risk manage things, you also have to, from a an investment standpoint, you also have to kind of always keep in mind of the bigger picture that's happening, and stay grounded. So I guess with that being said, just I think like the biggest like confirmation that we got, and the most interesting piece of news last week, and we're getting more insights to it this week, is really around Google's partnership with Apple for Gemini models, and effectively integrating their models as part of Apple's foundation models, which is basically white labeling everything, right? And then using that as their foundation to build out more advanced Siri functionality. And even this week, just kind of to add on to it, it's not just Siri, right? It's actually thinking about creating a fully fledged chatbot OpenAI type solution, agentic type assistant that is going to hopefully be pretty good because it's using Google's technology, and then, you know, scaling that out and integrating it with potential devices. Like we got news of them launching a pin, right? And you know, I just think that it's really, like, we're going to look back on this and it's going to be a kind of a landmark event, like a milestone event in terms of how we interact with technology in our devices. And, you know, just love to kind of get your thoughts on it, and we can just kind of go back and forth, you know, from there.
Yeah, I kind of agree with what you sort of laid out in the invitation. I remember you and I spoke kind of August, September of last year as this DOJ ruling on Google, whether it was a monopoly or not, and whether they could continue to have a relationship with Apple. And Paul Glencher obviously, you know, really made a great call
Crushed it.
in what the verdict was at.
He crushed it. Yeah.
Was going to be there. But I remember we were talking about this. You and I were kind of thinking, so what would be the scenarios? How would this play out? And I think our conclusions were, and it luckily turned out to be right, was that ultimately Apple was always going to partner with Google, given their search relationship going back however many years. And you know, I love OpenAI. It's like, well, we didn't really want to partner with Apple. I mean, give me a break. I mean, they had no chance against Google, given the long tenured relationship with it. And Google, like they learned with search, they're super smart. I mean, the reason why search became such a dominant presence, 80-90% market share, was once they got onto the iOS platform, that was game over for any other competition. Because it's all about distribution. Once your technology is completely distributed and it becomes like the, you know, the sort of the default setting for everybody, nobody's going to go anywhere else if it's a good enough product.
Yeah.
So I think they did the smart thing, and I'm sure Apple also thought like, hey, Google has probably the best underlying technology, which you've talked about on the AI side, and they were just waiting for this DOJ ruling to clear, so that they knew what the sort of guardrail was going to be about this relationship. And they say it's non-exclusive, but you know, basically it's exclusive unless Apple in the future decides to do their own thing, which I suspect they won't. But who
Yeah. I mean,
knows?
I think I think the point on distribution, you know, is pretty critical, right? Because, you know, Apple is in a unique place from, you know, a hardware standpoint, right? It's built out an incredibly strong and loyal ecosystem of users, both on the consumer side, but even on the enterprise side as well. And, you know, if you don't have distribution for your products, right, it doesn't matter, right? And so that's why, you know, this Google deal is pretty critical. And I think, you know, it comes down to this concept of, like, that we talk a lot about, and I talk a lot about it more, is like the abstraction layer, right? So when you look at it through the history of time, like, there's always been some type of like new abstraction layer, like some form of disruption, right? Whether that's, you know, the rise of the personal computer, or whether that's the internet, right, disrupting how information is analyzed and accessed, and abstracting away all those layers. Or in the case of, you know, agentic AI and automation, abstracting away a lot of the human flows, you know, or like, you know, you could even go back even and look at even more nuance. There's so many examples, right? Like, you know, in music streaming, right? And looking about like going from vinyl to 8-track to tapes to CDs to the internet. You know, videos the same way with Netflix and the death of cable and all this disruption that is constantly happening tied to technological innovation. I mean, the iPhone itself, right, actually, you know, was in itself like a new abstraction there. They were basically like, look, like, I remember like watching the keynote speaker, the keynote event back in the day, right? And it was like, look, like, they have a keyboard. That's the problem, you know? And they have, no, it's going to be the apps, and you're going to click with the apps, and it's going to be this whole new ecosystem that gets built off of it. And I think the risk going forward, and by when I say risk, I mean, it's also the opportunity, right? Like the disruption that's going on, and why software stocks are collapsing, and, you know, there's all this debate and contention out there. It's because everyone's trying to figure out what is going to be that new abstraction layer, what is going to be that new layer that people are going to be interacting with. And in the case of Apple, right, it's the risk for them, right, is that if the AI personal assistant, right, becomes the new operating system, becomes the new abstraction layer, so you're no longer going to your phone, clicking text messages, opening up your email app, right? Just by virtue of doing that, right, it has huge implications in terms of how you act and interact with other things on the phone, right? Because if you take your phone out of your pocket to text somebody or look at an email, right, you're also going to be more likely to open up Meta, Facebook. You're going to be likely to open up Twitter and all these other applications as well. And as that engagement shifts, you do kind of lose the potential lock and control, right, with the audience or with your customer base, right? And history tells us that if you can control the relationship with the customer, you control pricing power, you control demand, and that's a really important place to be. And so for Apple, it's one of these things where if they didn't invest in AI, they don't look at their CapEx as a percentage of revenue, right? Super low. They didn't have anything in the way of a general LLM, so they were behind. And meanwhile, I have a Pixel and an iOS device, right? That's not that is not an accident, right? Because you learn, you get to see what these different solutions are offering, the different phones are offering. And one of the things that Pixel came out with more recently with Gemini is the ability to have Gemini access your entire screen on your phone, right? And that is a big deal, right? Because if that becomes the way, you're just engaging with an agent who is then operating the operating system on your behalf, and that agent layer supplants the application layer, then do you actually really care if you're on an iOS or an Android device? Not really. You really care more or less if that agent is actually going to do what you want to do when you want it, right? And I could go on and on and on about it, but that's, I think, your point on distribution and the broader theme of disruption. I think that's why this deal is so important, because it sets Apple's future, right? Otherwise, if Google just had this, right? Think about it. If Google has the best AI models and they have hardware, and that actually became the competitive advantage, being the agent, and Apple didn't have that, then on a long enough timeline, you could actually paint a scenario where iOS and Apple actually starts losing market share of devices.
Right.
So it's interesting times.
It's a really good question, because it makes yesterday's announcement from Apple kind of really interesting. I mean, the announcement of this Siri chatbot that'll be released later this year, based off of Google's foundational models, as well as just Apple Intelligence, which will roll out or be announced in WWDC in June. I mean, clearly, to your point about, them having control of this abstraction layer, or as you termed it, like the chief of staff of your, the agent working across your apps or your software and hardware. I think clearly that chatbot is their way to circumvent that potential risk long term. But when you think about it broadly, I think this debate's really good. It's a really good exercise to go back and say, why are these platforms, why did they become so dominant? Whether it's Apple, iOS, Google, Amazon, even Microsoft. So, why did they become so dominant? And because each component of what they are very good at, if you just took it discreetly, you could see a situation where you could disintermediate that. So the point I'm trying to make is I think the reason why these platforms have been so dominant, and it's a good question to ask, will it be dominant in the future? I actually kind of lean towards, I think they will, is that they've been able to integrate the software or the application that you and I or a business would interact with, the hardware. And when I say hardware, I mean broadly, it's just not just the hardware, but the actual compute infrastructure that supports the whole software user interface. And then the third being the data. I mean, when you combine those three things and integrate together, that's really hard to break it from a competitive perspective. So you could take each of them separately. So Apple, clearly their software hardware integration is as good as anybody on the planet. And now they also have your personal data. So whatever they want to do in terms of personalized agent to you or personalized AI to you, the consumer, it's going to be very specialized for you. But this is kind of why, you know, and we've had this chat too about like, these LLMs are so much capex. Are they going to generate return? What's the future? And I think we get this. There's potential. You see this bifurcated future where you have the large language models, the world models, where the guys with the biggest balance sheet, the most money, can keep spending, will have the scale, and scale in and of itself becomes the moat. And then you have the specialized smaller models where they are they have discrete, unique information, whether it's your personal data on your Apple phone or JP Morgan's banking financial transaction information of you as a customer, everything you've done on your checking account, your credit card account, whatever it is, everything that is discrete to you that JP Morgan has, that they can now create an agent themselves and say, hey, Andrew, we now have a JP Morgan financial agent for you. As you can use that agent to surf your financial database within JP Morgan and use their products and whatever you want to do specific to your history with them. But nobody will ever be able to access that other than JP Morgan and you. I mean, there's no third party app or agents ever going to get in there because JP Morgan will never allow that. And I think that's the same with Apple. And I think the same with with Amazon too. And Google within its own ecosystem, if it did it itself, whether it's Android. And therefore, so no third party agent, I don't think, is going to be allowed into those walled gardens because, to your point about how valuable that that layer is to those specific companies. But I think what supports those guys is those three things combined. It's not one separate thing. Without one of those three things, I think the models, the platforms could be broken up or disintermediated. But those three things together, it's hard not to crack.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're essentially describing is like context, right? Like any model is only as good as its inputs, right? And at the end of the day, like these large language models, like that's why prompt engineering is a thing. In the case of Apple, they've historically been very focused on privacy. That's been their main angle. We saw this when they got rid of the ID for advertisers and they rolled out ATT, app tracking transparency, back in 2020, 2021. And we saw how that impacted the rest of the app ecosystem, including, Meta. And so they're taking a very similar approach in terms of protecting their user data. They've talked about, private cloud compute, right? So effectively, running a lot of the AI models locally on the device, right? To the extent that they can, keeping a lot of the personal data on the device, and then effectively, using their own cloud, right, for excess processing, right? But the foundation models are only going to do so much, at least the core Apple foundation models as it was, and that Google was going to be able to provide kind of the world context, right? And a lot of the agentic capability. And so you bring these two things together, and especially Google being multimodal, that's another critical factor here, right? Like Anthropic's great, their models are fantastic, but it's not multimodal, right? OpenAI, not necessarily multimodal. Like they have Sora, they have other things, but as far as having a truly integrated model that is fully fledged, image, video, like they don't have that necessarily generally available yet. So, and that's, I think, a huge component of this, and also why you have to go with the Google, right? Because you need that type of enterprise safety net. And, I was actually reading an article last night where it actually looks like, they actually might be leaning more heavily into Google from a compute standpoint, because actually Apple itself doesn't have the infrastructure and the cloud capacity to support all this inference.
Right.
So they actually may be working on creating like a typical cloud partnership, more like an expansive cloud deal, right, with GCP, and where they actually offload more of that compute, right, into their servers, but still working on a way of maintaining like a privacy firewall, right? Because the last thing that they're going to do, right, or would ever do or want, is for all of a sudden all your data to then just be purely accessible by Google and seen by Google. So there has to be that, but that is effectively where they're competing on. They're competing on kind of integration and experience if you're Apple, and on the data side, and ultimately context. I agree with that, 100%.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I think if you look at the WWDC last year, they kind of described the infrastructure, or what their Apple Intelligence infrastructure would look like. And as you just said, a lot of it was going to be housed externally with LLMs, where they would almost like carve out capacity that would be solely for Apple's purpose, but it would be really managed by Google in this case.
yeah,
And then they would just the data would flow back and forth, and then much of the inferencing required for using your personal information to deliver service and products to you that are unique to you would be on the phone. And yeah, there's still some things on the hardware side they need to do in terms of memory to be able to really make it a fully fledged inference product. But I suspect the next couple of generations of phones, they'll be able to have a fully AI enabled phone that can do a lot of the inferencing on device. But to your, additionally to your point, I think if you read through what Apple kind of released yesterday, even within that, the relationship with Google, they've kind of structured in a way where it's the models, whatever it is, whether it's internally with an Apple or with Google, it can be interchangeable.
yeah.
So they kind of built in this ability to, in the future, if there was another model, hypothetically, they could switch out. I honestly don't think they would choose to do that. I mean, I'm sure they had opportunities through the search relationship where they could have considered outside parties, but
Yeah, I mean, I honestly, I think that's like a PR move, like a strategic, like, move in
right.
terms of how they're just communicating that, just given how close they are following the antitrust decision. They're still going
Yeah,
through
that's very true.
because, but I think we can just see it for like it is, right? Like sure they can swap it out, but there's a lot. It's not as fungible as I think people think it is.
Right.
So but anyway, I kind of like, I think there's a good segue here. You mentioned Amazon before, but like maybe just like kind of thinking this through a little bit, like the downstream effects on, this, let's say we start integrating with our phones and devices, right, through this agent layer, right? And what does that mean for the rest of the app-based ecosystem? What does it mean for e-commerce players? And maybe thinking through like the bull bear debate a little bit. Curious to kind of get your thoughts on it.
Yeah, it's a hard question because when you think about all the apps, the app ecosystem, a lot, as you know, with iOS and Android, obviously the apps are developed by whatever the companies are, whether it's Booking.com or whatever, and then it's designed for those software platforms. So if you fast forward to a world where you have an agent that's basically doing the work for you to either to fulfill a transaction or to plan something for you in advance, um, you know, will they disintermediate those apps or some of those apps and go directly to the source provider, be it like a hotel or be it a restaurant or whatever it may be? Um, and it's a good one. I don't know, to be honest with you, what the real answer is going to be because I think if whether it's an Amazon or an Apple or Google, if they have their own agents that are unique to their walled gardens or their ecosystems, I presume that they would probably partner with all those app providers to say, look, hey, you got to give us permission to have, Andrew's iOS agent that's unique to him to be able to browse everything and collect this information and put it together for him, depending on the requests that he wants. And I'm assuming that given the power of those ecosystems, whether it's Google, Apple, or Amazon, that it's going to be hard to say no to those guys if you want to be part of that system. But it's going to be hard, man. I don't know how it's going to play out because I'm trying to think back to when the internet came along, how disruptive that was. I mean, and we haven't seen the AI native products yet. So all this conversation could change, in a few years' time when we see that first AI native company. But when we go back to utility for the consumer or like an enterprise, if you take the internet example, we couldn't see as consumers what this internet thing was really going to be until we saw Amazon.com, eBay.com, Priceline.com. They were, and then obviously Google, Facebook, and Netflix. Those are the first of the internet, 2.0 native companies built on the internet. Once that infrastructure was laid in the ground and the costs collapsed, and you could just, build applications off of that cheap infrastructure, that's when we start to see the utility of it.
Yeah.
Delivered to you very cheaply through your internet connection. And that opened the world up for everybody to like how to do commerce in a different way that we never thought we would do, and how to watch things, how to view things in a way that we never thought we would do. We're still TBD on the AI native stuff, but
Yeah.
I think that's the bit that we haven't seen yet. And so, to your point earlier, like the disruption is still ahead of us. We don't know where it's going to go.
Yeah.
So,
I'll throw out some potential scenarios, right? Just for the thought experiment, right? I mean, so, and let's just take like some examples, right? So if I am going to Texas, right? I'm going on a trip to Texas for work. I would typically log into Concur, right? Either the website or through the app. And I would, it's a database, right? So I, as the user, would just input everything. That's the old way, right? In terms of database control and working with the application layer directly. And, I would look at all the options. I would think through everything. I want to be in at this time. I want to leave at this time. Let me look at the different price options. Am I loyal to one airline versus the other airline? And then I would click through that whole process, right? And then I would check out. And then I would go get on the airplane, or I would get a car service at the airport, then get in the airplane, check in, get to the airport, open up my app, find an Uber, call an Uber, right, and go. All those steps, right, processes can in theory be replaced with an agentic capability, and the question becomes what context, what rules are in place that govern which agent chooses what, because that reflects everything I just described is my brain, right? It's processing and making individual decisions, right, that are optimized for me in that moment. And so the question becomes, how, from a technology standpoint, can you inject that type of context and knowledge into an AI agent, right? So, for example, if Siri turns out to be the next best thing powered by Google, right, and I'm like, hey Siri, I need to go book a trip to Texas, right? And it's going to go look at my inbox. It's going to search everything for context. And we're going to go back and forth. And I'll be like, I want to get in at this time. And they may be like, well, your first meeting doesn't start until 11 p.m. Usually you get the 6 a.m. flight to Dallas, but because of this, you can save yourself $200 if you take the 8 a.m. flight to Dallas. All right, Siri, book it. Now, how does Siri know actually where to book it? They're either going to have access to the Concur app, right? but they're going to need to know what my preferred airline is, right? Do I fly Delta? Do I fly United? Right? And then also loyalty programs, right? For example, become, I think, really important in this scenario because when I get to the airport, or even before I get to the airport, it's just gonna be like, do you need a car service to get you from the airport to the hotel? And in that scenario, I'm gonna be like, yeah. And then it's gonna go back and it's gonna search for context and it's gonna be like, well, he's a Delta Sky Miles member, right? And Delta Sky Miles, by the way, has a partnership with Uber, right? And if I go look at DFW, the airport actually has a Uber partnership where they give them preferred drop off and pickup at specified spots. So in that sense, you know, Delta and Uber just really secured, right, a lot of you know, security in this agentic future that we're describing. Whereas if somebody doesn't have loyalty, right, then in theory it's kind of like a commodity, and I don't care, right? Just pick me the best airline, right? I don't need Uber. If Lyft is what works, that's, you know, the same exact thing. And so, you know, that's where, you know, Apple providing that context, I think, is, you know, really important. But I think it also presents like a tremendous amount of risk to like the long tail of apps, right? So if you're not a mission critical app, you know, you're going to be like, discovery is going to be impaired, right? That's going to be an issue. If you're an ad supported app, not necessarily for gaming, I'm not talking games, but I'm talking like, you know, Instacart, for example. Like if you're Instacart, right, and you're trying to grow an ad business that's impression based, right, because you want someone to go into your app and do it, that is a big problem, right? Because all of a sudden, even though you might still be using Instacart, right, you're not the one that's actually opening the app and using it. So it does, I think, represent like a pretty big risk to engagement, especially, you know, even for like social media apps, and time spent potentially. If we end up spending less time on our phones, which we know is like actually the thesis of like OpenAI in terms of what they're trying to do, is to get us to do things less on device and more by interacting with the agent layer more directly and having them do things for us. So it's going to represent a lot of like, I think, structural change, business model shifts. Partnerships going to be really critical in this scenario. And you know, you're gonna have to have just like a killer value proposition, like in terms of a product being sold or unique inventory. You know, I want to talk about e-commerce, but just like, you know, and if Sean Jenkins from GLL is listening, just give him a shout out. Like, love him, he's great. And we talk about kind of like OTAs and like the disruption potential for like AI, but you know, think about it, right? Like the OTAs are an aggregator. That is like at its core, like that's what their value proposition was, and that's what the rise was. And in markets that are highly fragmented and hard to access, right? Like in Europe, for example, or like Airbnb, for example, like to fragment because it's fragmented with individual rentals, like that value proposition is real, right? Like the value as an aggregator increases. The risk, of course, is that you know, with AI and these agentic commerce protocols, especially, right? Why can't a Google you know, agent or an OpenAI agent just basically integrate directly with all of the hotels directly, right? And create a framework, and then all of a sudden the best deals and the best inventory, right, are now available to you, accessible, right, within the same request, right? You know, it doesn't require you to go to Priceline or Expedia or Marriott's website to price shop, right? It just all gets collapsed in upon itself. And I think from a, you know, from a, I guess from a shopping and e-commerce standpoint, right? Like what we're effectively talking about is like historically, like the website, like you have discovery, the discovery process, that then leads you to clicks you to off site, right? To a merchant site or through an app where you then check out and there's a post-purchase process. Like what the whole agentic process represents is collapsing that middle layer, right? So it's more about like intent, the agent connecting to the merchant API. And in that situation, like discoverability, you know, becomes a little bit more difficult, right? And will transform differently. And you could potentially, right, get disintermediated for like if you're I think in Amazon, like I actually think like Amazon is potentially more at risk from an e-commerce standpoint if they try to close down, right? Because they sell a lot of products and services, right? That in theory you can find elsewhere, right? They're a demand aggregator. But if you're a Shopify and Shopify store, and you could also be a Shopify store and brand and sell it on your website on Shopify and also sell it and distribute through Amazon. I think that what the AI discovery process actually does is it democratizes, right, that element, and it actually helps smaller long tail e-commerce companies, right, get more airtime and not be as locked into the closed garden that has become Amazon. And Amazon's going to have a hard time trying, or is going to be forced to try to self-disrupt in some way, right? Like it's like the classic innovator genre. Do I open up my ecosystem and embrace this, right? Or do I try to close it down, keep all my data, keep everything in, right? And risk demand and all this agentic flow happening outside my four walls. And it's just, I mean, it could go a lot of other ways too, but just wanted to. I figured I'd just throw that out and see and riff and see what you think on that.
Yeah, it's a good question in the sense that, using the example of like the hotel industry, particularly in Europe where it's so fragmented. I guess the question for me would be like, at what cost, if you're the hotel operator in Italy and you're like a one hotel operator, the cost to you going through booking.com versus like hundreds, thousands of agents that are going to come to you for inquiries about hotel room availability. I mean, that's why I don't know how it's going to play out, and I mean it sincerely. It's some of the spaces I struggle with. It had part of the reason why I think these platforms became so successful post the internet was, you're right, the layers of distribution got collapsed. But the aggregation element of like what Amazon does, and really the fixed cost. I mean, going back to my sort of three-pronged sort of idea of why these platforms are so powerful, of data, uh, infrastructure, and then the app layer, the software part of it, or the UI, is that you know, Amazon and Apple and Google can remain a walled garden, because if they give you, convenience, rewards, other ancillary products and services for free, pretty much. So if you're a Prime customer, you're getting Prime Video for free, pretty much.
Or you have the Prime credit card, the Amazon Prime credit.
You're getting rewards, cash back on the credit cards in that walled garden. And then also with that fulfillment infrastructure, that keeps getting better every year. They keep giving you, they're able to every time or every few years. So, okay, hey Andrew, it was one day, but actually it's going to be same day next year. And some things it could be within a few hours.
Yeah, and that's something that like Shopify just can't. I mean, people value that, right?
Yeah.
That's like real world physical constraints, right? Like next thing it's going to be drones, but but that's actually like a really good point. That's a very valid point.
I think those tangible, real, hard sort of physical things are really hard to duplicate. So, if you take one of those three things, and yes, you can definitely, disrupt the platform and disintermediate that one thing. But those three things combined, it's like, wow. I mean, to compete with, I would put Shopify and Apple and Amazon in the same category, because like they're building, the scale is going to give them that fulfillment ability. That how do you compete with that? If you were to hypothetically create an AI agent that's going to be your shopping agent across hundreds of retailers and services companies you want to go to, if Amazon says no, you can't use that agent you have to use the Amazon agent, or Walmart says you got to use a Walmart agent, or app, or Google says, hey, you got to use a Google agent. This is why this is again. I honestly don't know. Are we going to have hundreds of agents like that we all
Totally.
have to
Oh my
interact with?
gosh, there's going to be so many agents. It's going to be agents everywhere. They're going to just
Yeah,
be,
it's like I mean, I
yeah.
don't know how that resolves itself. I mean,
I
does it
mean,
resolve itself in some way in the future where some company that's AI native comes along and breaks the whole thing up, and you have this one super agent that does everything? I don't know, but it
yeah,
just
I mean,
seems like
I think the super agent could be like, the Siri equivalent, right? Like it's going to be whoever controls the personal assistant, like
maybe
whoever's that chief of staff, right? But the thing is, like, the chief of staff is going to be the closest to you, right? They're going to know what you need, when you need it, how you like your coffee, right?
right.
When do you need your soup by? Do you want it pressed, steamed? When your kids are at school, they're going to know everything, right? And then that agent is going to delegate with other agents. But like in reality, like the thing is, like, we can make AI as complicated as we want, and it is complicated, right? From a technology, from a coding standpoint, from an architecture standpoint. But what we're effectively trying to do is just replicate human nature, right?
Right.
Like, and so in many ways, we could just, just it's easier to just often think about it in that context, right? And so you have your chief of staff, but that chief of staff will be the dry cleaning agent, right? And that dry cleaner is going to have very, very specialized context and knowledge,
Yeah.
maybe not its own model, but very specified instructions on how to be a dry cleaner, right? Yeah, that's just one example, right? And maybe it's not a
But
great.
you mentioned something earlier, and I wanted to ask you this too. It's like you mentioned like e-commerce and how online payments kind of developed as a mode of transaction, versus like cash and card and physical payments. But would love to get your thoughts on this. Like I was trying to think about how as online payments developed and became a thing, like how did that competitively change the industry? Because clearly there were fiefdoms that were against like having this one super payment app that could work across everything, because the banks were like, no, this is like our territory, we're going to do our own thing. Visa, MasterCard said, no, we're not going to let anybody disintermediate us. And then like the Walmarts and the Amazons created their own thing. So like we kind of we're not going to allow anybody to come in and just have the. So like when PayPal came along, they partnered with retailers, signed them up to say, you pay with PayPal, and you could input all your information. That was like a one-click way for you to make that payment. But that was a painstaking process of getting acceptance. Kind of like it was kind of like an agent, a paying agent for you,
Yeah,
somewhat a dumb agent,
a
but
wallet.
still,
Yeah, wallet. I
yeah, it was
mean,
a wallet. Yeah,
yeah, and vertical integration, like, is what, like, I mean, that's why I'm so been, I don't know, on Google, like, it's just like it's a it's about like owning the entire experience, right? Owning the customer relationship.
right,
Shop Pay is only a thing because they have so many merchants on their platform,
right,
right? And PayPal was early on in payments, right? Let's be real, they've had their fair share of issues too. But in the context of like, I think this is actually important because if you look at like these protocols are just like, it's so early, Sam, right? Like these protocols, like MCP, model context protocol, only really became a thing in early 2025,
right,
right? Agent to agent protocols and interoperability standards, right? In terms of how different, like a standard for different agents to interact with each other, was only first like developed in 24 and is actually just really starting to become a thing late in 25 this year, right? These commerce protocols, everyone's trying to figure this out now. And that's what you're seeing. You're seeing this with OpenAI coming out and launching their, commerce protocol and integration with Stripe, right? But really the big thing is like Google coming out, right? And with their universal commerce protocol, I think it's actually, it goes right to the heart of this because it's universal. So if you actually look at like Google's like what they're working with Walmart and everybody, it's a way more open system, right? Like, yes, it's obviously designed and works better for like Google properties, right? Which is not a bad thing for a lot of people considering the size and scale of Google and Google people, so like integrating with Google search. But on the payment side, right, they do like allow the integration with Google Pay, right? But they are also giving people the option to insert a separate payment method in there, right? That's why they announced the partnership also with the big payment providers. So what they're doing is they're actually going like basically what they did and how they built, they're taking the search playbook, man, right? Like in terms of how they like built search and all the integrations, right? And aggregating that, they are literally building the search or the operating system equivalent for the agent layer, right? On whatever this internet 2.0 is, or 3.0, whatever you want to call it, right? By establishing this protocol and also by owning the agent to agent protocol as well, they can integrate that. So when you do, and so if you are in Gemini or you're in search, right, the agent can search for a product and it can handle, right, not only the discovery element, but it can also transact an app. And most importantly, the merchant maintains the data element and the merchant of record. But what's cool is they also provide this JSON manifest where basically the merchant can just say exactly all the different services that it provides. So that could be return service, promotional, like all the real-time inventory tracking. So it's always, as long as the merchant is updating this, it's always just like a merchant website has to update its tags, right? For SEO optimization, right? You always have to update your website to make sure that it's relevant content, but also getting the best information to the Google search engine so you show up higher in the search results. It's the same thing, but in an agentic protocol, right? But it, and historically, like Walmart's, again, like they didn't want you to not go to their website. Like that was the issue. They wanted that site traffic because that's how they converted, that's how their systems were, that's how they tracked. And also it's how they controlled the relationship. When Pinterest, right, in 2021, like there was rumors that Microsoft or PayPal was going to acquire, right? And because the idea then was that they had the discovery, they were going to be the shopping catalog of the world, right? And if you could just close the loop between intent and transaction by being able to buy something on the platform without clicking out, that could be like really powerful. But the problem was that their largest advertisers didn't want them to do that. Sure. Right? So the whole thing kind of blew up. Fast forward to today, and the whole way that people access the internet has changed. And so the merchants are like, well, we have to figure something out, right? And they're giving up on necessarily the control over wanting someone to actually go to their website, right? But they're still getting the merchant of record and the data. So they're not giving up everything in the process. Right. And I think that's why, like OpenAI's protocol is very based on their own chat system. It's also integrated more directly with Stripe, right? Whereas Google's is open to everybody. And I think that is strategically the right way to do it. And that only further entrenches them both on the advertising side, right? And on the AI side. And the last thing I'll say, because like now you've ripped me open and I could just go on this forever, but the concern about Google and search disintermediation has always been around the ads business, right? Yeah. Well, guess who's putting ads in their chatbot? OpenAI. Google, not so much, right? Because they don't have to. Why is that? Well, because they're growing their Gemini base, right, via subscription, but they still have the search business that they're transforming, right? And they have that advertiser auction dynamic embedded in the whole flow. And because people are still using AI overviews and search, right, they can link it together with Gemini, right, and get that same type of signal without actually having to show you a promoted post directly inside the Gemini application. Right. And so it is like they get to almost have their cake and eat it too and continue to take market share. And it's just like, and get better signal. It's the coolest thing ever because they actually like have figured it out and they're running faster and faster and faster. Right. So it's, I mean, yeah, like we don't know how it's ultimately going to end up. And there's a lot of things that are going to change along the way, but like, it's pretty freaking cool to see it all happening like in real time because it's going to impact everything. Like just like mobile phones, the internet, streaming video, just we're on this cycle, and it's pretty awesome.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing we learned with the internet is that, the winners are a relatively small group and the losers are a very large group.
Yeah.
And, that process of the market trying to figure out who's who can be a painful one. I mean, software is almost another discussion for another day. But
Totally.
like, I mean, it's not to say, I mean, it's an open question whether software is dead. But the fact that that's a question is what the problem is, and nobody can really put their finger on the terminal value of these companies. And until that gets cleared up, it's a tough space to, the lessons you learn, you learn many lessons investing in this market, but one of the ones you learn is don't catch a falling knife. And right now, these are fastly falling knives,
Yeah.
and I don't know what it's going to take
I don't know
to
either.
sort of get the market to see which models within software are going to survive.
Yeah, I mean, software, you're right. Like we could probably, yeah, I mean, actually, I think we should say that probably for another conversation.
Yeah, let's do that. Yeah,
Because, but I did want to just like your point on Amazon too is also, you made me think about it, and a little bit more. And, I guess like, Amazon obviously has a really strong ecosystem grip, right? I still think like on the margin, from a discoverability standpoint, AI represents a risk to the extent that they don't participate, right, in these types of open protocols, like with Google, for example. But it would be the same type of risk as if you said that, Amazon, didn't participate in Google's ad auction, right? Like there is or like they didn't have good SEO optimization. So, I guess like there is that piece. And then, through these agent to agent protocols, there can be secure handoffs, right? From, whatever the, chief of staff agent is to the Amazon agent, right? And
agents talking to agents.
yeah, no, that's what it is.
Yeah,
Like, I mean, and when we talk about software, it's like software building software. Like,
right.
the whole thing is that it's iterating constantly. And, I think for, like what that does, like the question is, and then we could also talk about this another time too, is like the impact on the ad model, right? Performance marketing, how does it evolve in this new landscape? What matters more from a brand advertising performance standpoint? Because there is a lot of disruption going on with that and traditional business models. The trade desk, for example, we're seeing it also to some extent with Reddit. But Amazon's built itself up like an incredibly large ad business, right? And I think these ad businesses are predicated on display ads, right, or surfacing products through promoted or sponsored ads that to get a person to click on it, right? And the way that the agent system's built today is that it's not optimized for that, right? Now it could be, and I bet dollars to donuts that within these agent to agent protocols, there are going to be auction dynamics that are embedded inside of it, right? Where you can almost like pay to promote and get a higher chance of an agent selecting your ad, right? Or your product. But then again, that's going to be, of course, open up a can of worms for people, right? Because it's kind of like payola with like music streaming, right?
And I guess ultimately, it's if you really break it down simply, it's like it's real estate, and can you stay relevant in the future? Relevancy will mean that you can keep and grow your user base. So Amazon's real estate, it's a website and the service it provides. Netflix's real estate, obviously Netflix has been starting to advertise too, based off of the size and growth of their sort of network or their user base, and then Google the same thing, and Apple. All these guys have big real estates that they can monetize, and to your point, like the ultimate question is, can these guys continue to stay relevant to that to their customers, such that the ad dollars, or the advertising money will
Yeah.
continue to flow that way?
I mean, like Meta, like let's take Meta for example, right? Like Mark Zuckerberg has always been in this fight with Apple, right,
Yeah,
over data, and he has this vision of like, I need to build the next generation computing platform. Like whatever, like we see these platform shifts over time, right? And the biggest risk, right, the death knell for any major technology company over time is missing the next big platform shift,
yeah,
right? So like IBM, they missed SaaS, or sorry, they missed cloud, right? Like everything grew around them forever, and then they underperformed, right? The smart companies are always innovating and placing these bets everywhere, right? So that, if something hits, they're not left out.
right.
But like with Meta, like what's super interesting to see is, they're making this big bet on glasses, right? And if that actually becomes kind of like the new primary, if that becomes the abstraction layer, right, or a major part of it, right, instead of the phone, then guess what? Meta is in a really good spot, right? But the risk is if they don't do this, and yeah, they're spending a ton of money on reality and all this stuff, and they're subsidizing the cost of these devices. But in this state that we like, the hypothetical future state where we're no longer interacting with our devices, or let's say our on device time holding in our phones down 50% over the next 15 years,
Right,
right?
right.
That's
Yeah,
really, really, really bad for Meta. That's terrible for Meta, right?
yeah,
Because,
yeah.
so
Here's my
like,
thing with Meta is that, if when you think about it, Meta, I compared with the other ones, I don't think Meta is a platform company like the other guys are, because ultimately they're reliant on other platform companies to host their apps.
yep,
They have the user base, it's massive
yep,
globally, and that in and of itself has been a moat. And even though the barriers to entry, as we've seen with TikTok and the other apps that have come along, come and gone, they've held pretty steady. That they've kept that large user base, but they don't control their
they're
destiny
going
with regards to the platform, which is why, as you said, Zuck
to
had an
obsess over.
existential crisis when Apple changed the way they could track
Identify
their users.
versions. Yeah.
And so, like, I can see. I mean, again, who knows what happens with this stock, in short to medium term, but structurally, you can see what he's trying to do with this meta compute and the glasses. The sort of the sort of uh, abstraction that he's trying to build there. The
Yep.
thing is, like, when you get back to the company, the model, and the stock, is that everything he does is margin dilutive. Anything he does is margin dilutive because, I mean, to give credit to Meta, it's of all of them, is probably the best profitable model of all of them. I mean, who makes 45% operating margins? Nobody.
Yeah. Yep.
Only
No.
Meta.
Super profitable.
Incredibly profitable. I mean, it's like
Yeah.
it's unheard
And
of
then
that.
that's after, and that's accounting for reality labs. That's
Exactly.
even
So
higher.
yeah, I mean, it's an unheard of number for one company that size to be able to do 45% operating margins. That was a beauty of the business. Like, everything was powered by their internal AI or machine learning, and we are the product.
Totally.
Dumping data and pictures or whatever, and creating this like sort of network effect of stuff. Um, but the thing is, when you think about every subsequent investment that guy wants to do is going to be margin dilutive. Obviously, reality labs we know about. Meta Compute, he's the great thing with Google. Google was an app too when they were just the little sort of box, and you'd have to you could use it on your device. You could there was a default search, but then they built GCP. They had the
And
machine learning capabilities and the science, internally, and that they built the infrastructure to what it is right now. And now they're a legitimate, number three in the cloud computing business, forgetting about AI, just in plain cloud computing.
yeah,
A Meta, you have to now face, okay, is AI existential to me? To your point earlier, time spent on my platform or on my apps, sorry, is that now a risk to me? One. Two, I don't have enough compute if I want to be like a leading edge model, like with these other four guys, I got to have that compute. So everything he does investment wise is margin negative. I mean,
yeah.
I don't doubt his resolve. I mean, he's
No,
like the
yeah, I think I agree with you. I think I think let's just put it this way, right? Meta has always been, I've said this billions of times, a higher beta business model, right? Part of it's because it's, a founder operated business, but also because it has been, attached to other platforms. It hasn't had control over its own destiny, right? So it's subject to concerns about competition. They've also historically didn't, because they didn't have a cloud business, never in a position of excess capacity or ever trying to be having excess capacity. And therefore they never invested and built out the same type of infrastructure, right, that an AWS and Azure and a Google had, right? And frankly, up until 2020, right, they were actually like super behind in terms of their footprint, right? Like they made a big bet on CPUs. They had a backtrack. Their data centers were like, they've always kind of been, and so part of the CapEx increase is also them trying to play catch up while also securing their future state. And I agree with like the uncertainty around it. And I think the strategy that he has is fairly straightforward in the sense that, he's trying to secure on the consumer side his presence in what's going to be the next compute platform. And then to secure the ad business on the business side, right? I think they're basically going to try to become a hyperscaler, right? And start to get into a lot of the business and services in the very long term that a Google currently has, and continue to build out that ecosystem. And that's the bet. But frankly, it's like Google. It's just funny. Like if we were having this conversation last year, right? Like we'd probably be saying a lot of the similar things, but the market and our probably conviction wouldn't be as high just because we haven't gotten confirmation of it yet. But the point is like Google still is just so much better positioned, right? Like across the board,
yeah. I
right?
mean,
And
I remember chatting to you about this last year. It's like we were like just baffled, but like Google has all this infrastructure, and they were like so early with machine learning and AI. With the DeepMind purchase goes back many, many years, and they were like the first real innovators in AI, and we were like baffled. How come they haven't like presented a product that based off of all their knowledge and their infrastructure? And then finally they eventually did with Gemini.
execution, man, like
Yeah,
execution has been it's always been their game to lose, and the execution has been
yeah.
phenomenal.
And,
So
like they got a wake up call, and kudos to them. They were the
Google investors can thank Microsoft CEO.
Yeah, I mean, seriously, yeah. I mean, the founders came back. I mean, they clearly had a code red situation where they rethought their whole thing, and they delivered a bang of product, and they're so far in the lead. I mean, I still think LLMs eventually get commoditized, and these things will leapfrog each other over time. But I think the marginal leapfrogging isn't going to be so big that Google wakes up and like their model is crap. I think OpenAI the next model will be really good, and people will be raving about that. But I think the differences are going to be so big that
Yeah.
it's somebody's going to die. I
To
think
your
it's
point, like scale, infrastructure, distribution matters a lot,
yeah.
right? And with these AI models too, the core LLMs will become less differentiated, but it's going to be less about the model itself and more about what you can do with the model and what you build around the model. Like the AI, stateless AI that you're getting, API endpoints, like instead of just like querying an LLM, you're actually like you're beginning querying an agent, right? Like you're going to be interacting with an agent via API that's built off the model that Google or someone else builds out. But we're at the time, we're over time. This has been great. Sam, I don't know. I'll give you the last, word if you have any. But
No, it's just been fun, man. Hopefully, if we get good feedback and people find it valuable, it'd be great to do it again. And I'm sure there's so many things we could talk about. We could be hours on this call, but really appreciate the time. And it's always fun chatting with you. So
awesome.
thanks for bouncing these ideas off of each other.
Yeah, no, this is awesome. All right. Cool, Sam. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and hopefully catch you here next time. Take care.
Thank you.